I will start by proposing a very simple explanation of what could be inclusive education, and I will try to move from that point to linguistic aspects. And I thank you very much for the previous presentations, which made a lot of space already for what I should say, because they introduced very important aspects of linguistic justice and ethics. So I will not repeat that, but I will move then to an understanding of what I know the best. I'm a philosopher, expert in applied ethics and normative ethics, so I try to move from linguistic ethics to inclusivity as social ethics simply. So I want to emphasize by the end of my speech that I believe very much that it is about ethics at the end. And that's why I think the whole purpose of the whole aim of this meeting to advance inclusive and balanced education is so meaningful. It is because we have in our hands the capacity to do something for that. Now, let me explain why I believe that it is the case. First, the definition of inclusion as inclusiveness is very simple. You can just look at the schema there, and you'll see that, in fact, you can understand simply inclusion by opposition to exclusion, which is, as we had in the colonialistic understanding, the deterministic understanding of history and the place of man in the world. A very good example. There are situations where we just close the door. That's exclusion, and that's where we don't want to go, right? So we have made some progress from there to segregation, which is a kind of more liberal model whereby you would concentrate some of those who are excluded, so to say, from the main bulk. And from there, you have integration, which is a quite interesting model because it is widely used in the vocabulary. Integration is a way to, in fact, include these groups without, in fact, separating them. So in the main bulk, as you see, that's the third option. And it is interesting to see that the parties are not melted in the whole, and that's why it's not inclusive, right? And even the whole in the inclusive fourth option is changing his shape slightly, because by having this fourth situation where we would insert all the parties together, we have a kind of adaptation of the whole structure which is needed by the simple fact of this inclusion. So this is very nice. From an epistemic point of view, we understand what is inclusivity and inclusion. How to explore now the linguistic issues or aspects of this inclusivity related to our use of language and the consequences that are related to it. As was mentioned, when you open the mouth, you are bringing not only your ideas, your concepts, but you are bringing the whole history of your language with you, your culture, the memory of your people, or the people behind, supposedly, the history of this language. And I say supposedly because it's sometimes a bit tricky. You know, we use, for instance, English, but if I remember well, I read somewhere, I think it was in the nice book of ForumBIE on linguistic justice, that even English could be considered as not related to Britain, but as a mixture between French and German that in the 5th century was in fact introduced to the British Islands. And so if we would consider English not as under the flag of Britain, but as a kind of first lingua franca, in fact, it's interesting to see that since the 5th century, we could just, you know, have a situation where we would not go too much in detail in the deterministic historical explorations of these concepts. I have the most respect for the historic understanding, of course, and the narrative behind. the imposition of one culture on the other, and it was really beautifully organized that I could speak after we have really heard about this very important understanding, deterministic, I would say, or historical understanding of how languages are of course, political decisions also whereby groups of people are obliged to some point to speak a language because they don't have any other choice. So that's what I would call the Spinozist view of the situation. If you would permit, I'm a philosopher, so Spinoza is one of my preferred philosophers. He's a great philosopher, so don't shy to really navigate and read about Spinoza. But Spinoza had a major disadvantage that he was not recognizing human freedom, right? He was a monistic materialist. He was the first of the kind, but he was also a beautiful thinker, integrating Jewish ethics and traditions in his mind and philosophy of ethics. But that's a deterministic view, right? And what I want to say is today, my topic is more a Cartesian view, not of the Spinozist kind, is focusing on the free will. I think with Descartes that, and that's why we are here all together, that we have the things in our hand to change the situation. For Descartes, we have a particular situation as human man. We have infinite will as God has. That's the only capacity that we share with God for Descartes. So if we take that seriously, and I tend to take that very seriously, then we just need to focus on what depends on us and what doesn't depend on us. For instance, it doesn't depend on me to be rich and to be in a nice palace as here for my vacations every year. It doesn't depend on me. So I will not be sad not to be here in the next years if I won't be here next years for a good reason, right? It doesn't depend on me. If I'm sick, I would, of course, not consider things that are related to be healthy. It doesn't depend on me. I'm sick. So one of the classical Stoic, in fact, ethical category or choice we have to consider is what depends on us and what doesn't depend on us. And once we have made this consideration, we can see the whole sea of possibilities open in front of us because there are so many things that depend on us. And now I will carry on with my presentation on precisely that's the deterministic understanding of reality that I want to challenge very strongly because I think for linguistic inclusivity and as well for education inclusivity, we need really to step out of deterministic views. And what are these views? As I said, it's to see that, in fact, we are brains. We have certain representations. We have a nice hotel, for instance. And that brings us a representation in the mind. That is, for instance, this is a nice place for exclusive people, for instance. Very nice place. But this is a reductionist view. This is why we call it the brain in the what type of explanation. This is a materialistic explanation. This says we can reduce simply the intention behind. So here we don't have any intention. We make the presupposition that we could reduce all our human intentions, and that's what has to do with ethics. And just to focus on what is deterministically reflected on us from outside. And that's very problematic to think that way, because take only the Wittgensteinian duck-rabbit dilemma. I don't know if you know it. It's a duck that you can watch, and suddenly it appears as a rabbit. It's the same form on the wall, so it's the same, like the building. But the rabbit could mean a duck because in your mind you are drawing a relation, in fact. It's an intentional, perceptual, phenomenal relation. It's a choice, simply, to focus from exclusivity as segregation, for instance, to exclusivity as generosity, for instance, as giving the exclusive place, for instance, for a child to be with his father and not to be with his sister at the same time, have the exclusive attention, to be in a nice place, to have an exclusive possibility to develop projects on inclusive education is positive. So it's upon our intentions that we can build, in fact, out of this brain in the what model, really what means normativity, either cognitively, so what brings knowledge, or normatively, ethically, what brings goodness, good education, generosity. I would want to just very quickly say why there are situations that are deterministic in our world, even if we say we are free and that we can't change. As we said for Descartes, doesn't matter, that exists. And it's sometimes interesting, for instance, the fact that many people speak languages that are, for instance, among the languages that were just listed before. Usually we list languages that start by more than 40 million speakers, and we would start by Chinese, and which has 1,300,000, I think, speakers. And it's fascinating how, of course, Spanish is the second one, which is interesting in this context. It's fascinating how, related to also the options on the technological side, this brings a new continent of hopes, of the hope of applying our knowledge and our values, our choices to new tools that technology brings. I give the example on the left. It's this website, perhaps some of you know. It's called the 1 million pixel website. It was a very exciting idea of a student who wanted to finance his academic first year at the university. He was just, a teenager, and he had the idea that he would sell all the pixels of this image. There are 1,000 times 1,000, so that's 1 million pixels, for $1 per pixel. And he got, in a couple of weeks, $1 million, and he could finance his whole curricula at the university. Because, why? Because there is a networking power of languages as for websites and technology related. And that's very useful as well. It's not there only just to dominate perhaps those who might not follow this website and not advertise, for instance, there, because it's of course the exercise is to advertise your enterprise. There are links that would then be accessible through this website to the enterprises that are advertising the activities. So as with languages, of course, there is this situation that those who are not there are losing some options. We find this same situation with capitals. If everybody considers Brussels, for instance, capital of Europe, it's not because Brussels is more interesting or has more capacity qualities than Berlin or London or whatever, Geneva. It's because there is already a networking power there in place since years. And we can't do otherwise than just accept it and be there. So there are also pragmatic situations whereby we need to, in fact, work with it and do something with it. So as an ethicist in applied ethics and also in information technology, also in ethics in research, so I'm interested in working since years to reflect on metrics for university scholars and metrics for documents that are published on internet or in print copies, and to reflect on the ethics behind these questions are key questions, because everything has to do about these capacities we would have to measure from one perspective new options, but also, and that's coming back to minorities and the issue of those who are not in the big picture. It's about being together to decide to help or to empower those who are in the minority setting, because Nahuatl, for instance, is spoken by 1,400 villages in Mexico. That's it. That's 1,400,000 speakers. That's a peanut. Nobody can develop, for instance, natural language processing softwares for translating automatically Nahuatl, for correcting grammatically automatically Nahuatl very easily, because you need big data for that. You need a lot of speakers to make it run, you know, the machines, and then, of course, to build, to have funds, also commercial interest behind, and so, of course, this is not the situation for main languages, whereby we have now very good metrics, possibilities, and translating machines, etc. And we would need, I think, really to sit together with the experts here who are since years already committed for applied linguistics, for applied inclusive justice in education, to tackle this issue of minority languages in a very effective way. That's about our choice, and it is about understanding, in fact, first, of course, what do we understand by linguistic ethics? A first definition of linguistic ethics, I will read it to you, is a very interesting one. It's a definition that would oppose to first an egocentric definition of linguistic inclusion. So egoistic would be typically the colonialist one, right? I'm installing myself here, and so everybody should speak my language. Obviously, that's not very ethical, right? But we would have a democratic criteria. Would it be inclusive, do you think, to have the best language of the majority be spoken by everybody here in the room? We are about 100 here. I'm not sure that that would be really very inclusive if the majority would impose really the language that we would need to speak. So what is the norm behind? What is the justice criteria? And I'm following here a categorization which was built by Van Parijs in his very good book on linguistic justice. He proposed a third option, which is Maximin type of criteria, which would be the best known language on average, but implying a winner-take-all simple language. Would it be interesting, no, to have, we make a referendum, we see who speaks how far, which languages, and then you know, we do the mathematical calculus and we say, okay, majority speaks Spanish best here, so winner take all. We would speak all Spanish. That's not very inclusive because someone could drop in from Macedonia not speaking at all Spanish. What about his situation? He would not understand. A fourth option is the possibility to have a fair division. That would be each language to be spoken as far as possible in proportion of the number of native speakers or average competency among the audience. So it would be already a quite interesting option. It would be to reflect on the proportionality of our capacities and to adapt, in fact, our discourse to this either the average, meaning, you know, we will level down but have the most decent proposition, or we would really try to make justice to the large number, to the greatest proportion of the best known language. But it is not either this one, which is the inclusive ethical criteria that I propose really to take seriously, but it is what is called by Van Parijs the Maximin criteria, which is, in fact, if we want an inclusive communication, we would need to ask ourselves which language is best known by the member of our audience who knows it least well. So that's the most important aspect to have in mind. To have in mind what is the language in our audience who knows it the least well. And if we end up by having an idea what is this language, then we could have a fairly good criterion of inclusive linguistic. am now just mentioning very quickly that although this is a very good possible conclusion to discourse about linguistic justice and ethics, it is unfair to think that it would be encompassing principle, because there are situations, and typically pedagogical situations, where we make the choice not to speak this language for good reasons. We want to learn Latin, for instance. Nobody, as a teacher, would ask first the students in the class, having to teach them Latin, whether Latin is known already, but by what extent, in which proportions, by those who speak it the least good. So it's about also putting a context, which is a context of access to decent education, inclusive education, but it is not necessarily a situation which is which is the explaining on all the possible context, because we know that in pedagogical situations we might need to be working on exclusive situations, and that's not bad. As I said, for instance, with the situation, the metaphor of the parents who are speaking with one of the child instead of both of the children of the family. To be exclusive in some situation brings also something positive. What I now want to do, there are three things before I stop, because time is running. First, I want now to pass from this linguistic explanation of what is inclusivity to a social ethical explanation. Of course, in this list there are many chapters of inquiry that we could, in the questions, rise and discuss. We have worked with Globetics on these topics, and I've written over 40 pages on this, so we could discuss, if you are interested by the details, but I want to go very fast now to this schema, which is a schema for what could be inclusivity from an ethical point of view. So here, you would need to imagine that we have a transformative model of inclusion. This is a transformative model of inclusion that starts, it's a kind of journey that you would start on the left, and you would start by having some ethical principles, but that I call them proto-ethical principles, because they are, to some extent, ethical, but they are not really ethical. I give an example. The capacity to have external authority. The fact that I'm a leader in my classroom is certainly not bad, but is it really sufficient to be a good teacher? I might doubt. That's why I say that's a proto-ethical principle of ethics. It's an authority-related one. You could have other ones. You have, for instance, majority rule-related principles that are not bad either. It's very good to make a referendum about majority preferences, but that doesn't mean necessarily that because the majority agrees on something that it is necessarily good. So we would need to build on the top some other layers in order to make some progress in our ethical journey, which is a kind of evolutionary journey, but in the non-materialistic sense. So it would go to spirituality instead of animality. So a third option would be family and church authority. So that's also a good example of something which is not bad. I mean, if I'm a church elderly and I'm developing activities on education in this context, that's just for the best of my community. That doesn't mean that that it is ethical, because the simple fact of being member of a church, of being member of a family, lacks some ethical basic aspects. And now I'm starting to address the ethical first principles, which are subjective ethical principles. And these are first related to artistic creation, so that's already very, very serious ethically speaking, because you are already dealing with life and our capacity of creation. A second one is the ethical principle of the right measure, absence of extremes. This is a very simple principle, which is never bad, but is ethical. You can't say there are situations where it is bad, when you apply it, it does not work. No. Avoiding extremes is always good. So that's an ethical principle. I continue with my ethical journey toward highest ethical principles. You have the principle of ethical sentiment. So all those of you who have been educated with British and Scottish Enlightenment ethics of moral sentiments or the various other options and traditions that have been developing these ideas in other continents, moral sentiments have always been as related to compassion, for instance, to sympathy, really deep motors of human existence. It's true in every world that if you have compassion, you have less sufferance and you have a better situation. So that's a very strong basis already of our subjective ethical principles toward inclusivity. And now I continue my journey to ethical principles of reason. We need to, at some point, address a great chapter of our journey, which is to say we need to build in reason, in fact, our ethical attitude of inclusiveness. We can't just say on the level of either proto-ethical, nice to have things, or simple subjective sentiment-based decisions. We need at some point to build on the rationality. That's the fastest way to have competency, to have sustainability. And the rest comes with it, the joy, the good life. Reason is very important. That makes us all common. That makes us a same family. So, but that's something that can be also declined in different ways. There are social ethical codes, for instance, of maxims and rules that are reason-based. There are ethical principles of reason that are related to legal ethics, that are related to the no harm principle, for instance, that are also reason-based, always good. You can't say there is an island there in the world where doing harm to someone is not bad. It's not possible. And these are reason-based. That means that it is really cross-cultural. It's totally horizontal. It is flying across all the continents, and it is valid in all the traditions. And now we are finishing this journey to those principles that are political principles, very important for legal justice and legal ethics. The cultural aspects is only possible, I think, seriously, if we take political decisions on that. So if we promote human rights, cultural rights, in the proper way, and as you see in our journey of ethical values, it comes quite late in our development from the ground, so to say, of a proto-animal to the childhood of humanity, if you wish, to the reason-based norms, and one of it being the political reason-based norms. And it ends by, I would say, metaphysical rational norms or religious-based rational norms, depending on whether you are very keen of one or the other. But there is a principle of unity, ethical principle of unity, which is on the top of this pyramid of values that I propose. But there is also another way around, which is the green arrows on the other, from right to left. This is to just mention that we are in a system that is a dynamic system. You can't say, okay, that's now the program, the menu. You learn it by heart, and then you have a good life. No, life is not so easy because we don't master our life. Life is given, right? So, of course, as a Cartesian, I would always say yes, but there is a good proportion of freedom, right? This freedom that I just introduced previously, and so we are not determined, and we can make the right choices, yes, but we have also values that are not strictly speaking related to ethics, that are cognitive values, for instance. What would increase knowledge is not always what would increase good life. justice, inclusivity. Sometimes, in order to increase knowledge, you are navigating in a sea where normativity, from an ethical point of view, is not absent. It's just under brackets, in a way, if you would permit me this metaphor. It's not that I would say that we can't be men of knowledge and men of ethics, of self-knowledge at the same time, but it's just to say that this is the journey of life. Sometimes we are focusing on building knowledge, and that means also to put on the brackets the rest of the reality. And so we need to be aware that sometimes we are in this situation. Yes, that's about the ethical values. Very quickly, generosity, because it is in the title of my paper. Generosity, why is it so key? Generosity is so key because, first, Descartes said it. Yes. Descartes, who is very well known for his metaphysics, because he's the first, so to say, of the early modern metaphysics, philosopher of metaphysics, that is the understanding of subjectivity as crucial for understanding the place of man toward knowledge first, toward what he can hope, to take a Kantian metaphor of it, and what is the good life, or what he ought to do. And it is, for Descartes, very important that of course, there is a self, but that's a complete misunderstanding of Cartesian ethics if we think he's a kind of protagonist of a libertarian, laissez-faire type of morality. He was not. He had a morality that was a mixture between Christian values, Stoic values, and Epicurean ethics. And to make it very short, there is a crucial value of generosity in all his ethic. That is the cornerstone of his values. I invite you to read his book on the passions of the soul, which is a very small booklet, and where he explains very well the dependencies between the different virtues and why generosity is so cardinal. But I'm sure that once we will all make this effort of exploration, we will understand the chance we have here and the opportunities that are open for inclusive education. Thank you very much.